Well, we're in our study of 1 Thessalonians. If you'd like to turn to that in your Bibles, over there about 2/3 of the way through your New Testament. Two little letters that are often just skipped over because they're rather short. I sometimes refer to them as twins standing in the corner. But they do have a lot to say to us today. 1 Thessalonians 2, 1-12 today. While you're turning to that, I forgot to mention a couple of things. One is the city is doing some work out here on Bayshore for the next while. We don't know how long it's going to take, but they're building some kind of a vault kind of thing for catch water. And so all of our parking on Bayshore, we're not going to be able to use for the next while. So if you're having to come to the office, probably the best thing to do is just park up here in our parking lot and work your way through. It's all going to get completed someday, folks. I guarantee it. It's going to get done. But that'll be at least temporary for that part. And the other is we've placed baskets out in our foyer today. If you'd like to just write a card or a note to Leah, I know that she would appreciate it. And just there's a place for you to do that out in the foyer today. That would be great. We'd appreciate that. 1 Thessalonians 2, 1-12, a life worth living. Last week we looked at chapter 1, and the title for that was A Church Worth Joining. And today, a life worth living. I ran across this statement by J.P. Morgan recently, and he was a financier, banker, and well-known person back in the last century. He, I don't know if you know this or not, but he was part of the merger of two different companies to put together General Electric Company. He was head of U.S. Steel for a while, and one other thing, big thing I've forgotten, but very well-known gentleman. And he made this statement about life that was interesting to me. He says, the wise man bridges the gap by laying out the path by means of which he can get from where he is to where he wants to go. And at first I read that and I thought, that's pretty good. I like that. I wish I'd have said that. And then I thought, it started looking to me like more of a utilitarian view of life and wisdom. It's simply getting from point A to point B. But that's not what the Bible has to say about a worthy life. A wise man desires to please God and let Him make the path for us. Big difference. So what is a life worth living? Well, from this passage today, I think we can at least begin to get at least the hem of the garment for it. Let me read it through, verse 12, and then we'll go back and break it down a bit. He says, for you know, brothers, of course he includes the ladies too, because there were ladies in this church. It was a small church at the beginning. There were some Jewish people. There were some proselytes, God-fearers they were called, Greeks who were attracted to Judaism. They converted to Christ. And then it says a number of prominent women also were a part of the initial body of believers. And so he includes both men and women and all classes as well. Our visit to you, that it was not a failure. It was not a failure. But having suffered previously and been treated shamefully in Philippi, just as you know, we took courage in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in the midst of much opposition. For our appeal was not out of error, nor out of impurity, nor out of deceit, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, thus we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, who continually tests our hearts. For neither in a former time did we come with a word of flattery, just as you know, nor with a pretext of greed. God is witness, nor seeking from men glory, nor from you, nor from anybody else, but being enabled to be weighty or influential as apostles of Christ, rather we became tender in your midst. Tender, or a synonym of that phrase or that word. As when a nursing mother cherishes her own children, thus taking much more care for you, we were pleased to give to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you became dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and our toil, night and day, working with our own hands. Paul was a tent maker, and that's the way he made his money. We did not become a burden to any of you. We preached to you the gospel of God. You're a witness of this, and so is God, how holy and justly and blamelessly we became to you believers. For just as you know, as each one of you, we were with you as a father with his own children, encouraging you and comforting you and urging you to walk worthily of God, the one who calls you into his kingdom and his glory. Out of that last phrase in verse 12, to walk worthily of God, comes the title for the message today, A Life Worth Living. What does that consist of? I think Paul gives us a few here that we need to look at. The first one is this: a life worth living is responsive to God. Responsive to God. In verse 12, he says for you to walk worthily of God who calls you. God is not mute. He's not deaf and dumb. He speaks. He calls. He invites. And it is up to us to hear and to respond. A life worth living is responsive to God. In verse 12 here, it says it's a participle who continually calls, not just at conversion. Sometimes I think we as Christians, we have heard this so much that it just sort of falls off our back. Yes, God does invite us to be converted. And if we respond, if we repent, we come into his family. But he continually calls. He just doesn't speak once and then shuts up. He continually calls. In verse 4, it says, but just as we have been approved by God. This is something that God does. He tests. This word means to test in order to approve for service. And we think of Abraham. We think of, did God just speak one time to Abraham? No. Did God just speak one time to Moses? No. Did God speak one time to Joshua? No. To Job? No. To Paul? No. God continually calls, and he tests us in order to approve us for service. Each one of these men that I've just mentioned, and ladies too, of course, he tests. He did then, and he does today. And in verse 4b, it says he continually tests our hearts. A life worth living is responsive to God. And when it says he tests our hearts, he's talking about our motives, why we do or not do what he is calling us to do. He tests our hearts. So that is one element of a life worth living. Are you listening and responding to God. Secondly, a life worth living does not let suffering or mistreatment derail you. Let me repeat that. A life worth living does not let suffering or mistreatment derail you. Look at verse 2. He reminds them of how they were treated in the city just before they arrived in Thessalonica. That was Philippi. And if you remember, Paul and Silas were arrested. They were publicly flogged. This is what was done also to Jesus. He was publicly flogged. That meant they were stretched out with their back exposed, stripped down, and they were beaten across their backs from their shoulders all the way down to their ankles. And then they were placed in stocks. Their feet were placed in stocks. Certain amount of distance wide apart, and they could not move. They were placed in those wooden stocks. And the fact that they were Roman citizens was why they were treated shamefully. Roman citizens were not to be treated like that. A life worth living does not let suffering or mistreatment derail you. What did they do? It says they took courage in God. In verse 2, that's what they did. In the midst of this suffering and mistreatment, this is how they made it through. They found courage in God, not in themselves or other people. This morning in the paper, I don't know if you noticed this, right on the inside of the front page, a beautiful picture of a sunset in Tom's Bayou in Valpy. And I thought, that's a beautiful sunset. I wonder who sent that picture in. And then I read, Bill Grigsby and his wife Nancy were boating through Tom's Bayou when he took this shot of a beautiful setting sun. You know, we in our church for 14 years watched Nancy Grigsby deal with suffering, physical suffering. I think she lost track of how many times she lost her hair, or how many wigs she had to wear, how many surgeries she had. And you know what? Hardly any of us knew at all. Because Nancy had found courage in God. And she led a worthy life. A life worth living does not let suffering of any kind or mistreatment derail you. I've been in ministry a long, long time, and I have seen people that suffered. Those who take courage in God find a way through it. They find a way through it. A life worth living does not let suffering or mistreatment derail you. A third, a life worth living has proper motives. In verse 10, it says, you are witnesses, and God too, how holy and justly and blameless we were with you believers. A life worth living has proper motives. Now, Paul lists at least 6 negative motives in this passage and 3 positive ones. In verse 3, he mentions the word error, that our gospel did not come to you in error, that is, something wrong with its content. Paul wasn't passing off any popular philosophy or his own thoughts. He was passing along the gospel of Jesus Christ, the full counsel of it. Paul quoted from the Old Testament. He would bring in present-day illustrations. He brought it all to bear. His content of his message was not in error. In verse 3, it mentions impurity. Impurity. This could possibly mean sexual impurity, although it's not limited to that. It could be impure motives of just about any kind. Also in verse 3, he mentions deceit. There was no trickery or manipulation with his presentation of the gospel in Thessalonica. In verse 5, he mentions two other negative ones. Flattery. Flattery. What is flattery? It's saying something good about another for your own benefit, that you'll get something out of it. If you build somebody up, you're probably doing it to build yourself up in some way in their eyes. That's flattery. Also in verse 5, a pretext for greed. This usually involves money. They were not there with a secret desire to gain money. And in verse 6, another negative motive, seeking honor or glory or applause from men. That's a negative motive. Then he mentions three positive ones in verse 10. Holy. This means rightly related to God and set apart for his glory, not our own. Justly. This is right relations with others. And blameless is that you are not faulted in the first two areas. Somebody can't find fault with you for not being holy, rightly related to God, and set apart for his glory, and having right relations with others. We need to listen to that. Sometimes it gets a little nebulous with God, but with people it can get pretty specific. How are you rightly related to others? That's a positive motive. About a month ago, in our paper, wound up an investigation and finally a court date and an indictment of the former pastor of Abundant Life Church in Fort Walton Beach, Pastor Larry Thorne. On August the 24th, he was found guilty of sexual battery on a minor and lewd and lascivious behavior with a child. He will face up to 30 years in prison for this that he had been doing. And he will register as a sexual offender for the rest of his life. What kind of motive did he have? It says God tests our motives. A life worth living has proper motives. Proper motives. And then fourthly, a life worth living has profound methods. Interestingly to me, Paul uses a metaphor about himself and his teammates. In verse 7, he said, they were there in Thessalonica in a tender way, gentle way, like a nursing mother with her own children. I don't know if you can get any more tender or gentle than a nursing mother. You just can't. Paul said, we were like that among you. We were gentle. We could have demonstrated our authority as apostles of Christ, he said, but we didn't do that. We became gentle among you. And then he uses one about a father in verse 11, a conscientious father, exhorting, comforting, and urging, not becoming a burden on them. As an apostle, they could have demanded that. They could have demanded obedience, pay even for the work that they had done. But Paul refused. He gave up his rights for that. What a contrast to today's society. Everywhere we turn today, I have a right to this. I deserve this. It's my right. That's what our society is just filled with that today. And Paul comes along and says, I have the right, but I'm not going to use it. set it aside. A life worth living has profound methods. For a man and an apostle to act like a nursing mother amidst the people, that is amazing to me. Profound method as a conscientious father. When Nancy and I were at New Orleans Seminary, we met a young lady by the name of Gwen Williams. She was called Miss Chocolate by her kids that she worked with down in the inner city of New Orleans. You see, Gwen was an African-American lady. She never married. Till to this day, she's a single lady. But she is one of the most delightful people you will ever meet in your life. She is funny. She's humorous. She can write poetry. She has amazing gifts. And at that time, she was a seminary student, and she was working in the downtown part of New Orleans with basically street kids. Most of them didn't have a mom or a dad. And she decided, she gave up her right to live on campus, and she moved downtown to be close to her kids. And day after day, she was with them. She'd go to class, she'd come back, she was with them. The Southern Baptist Convention was coming to New Orleans one year. This was back in the 80s. And she got her kids into a little choir. And I'm telling you what, they could sing the stars down. And somehow or another, the bigwigs that put the Southern Baptist Convention together heard about this, and they had Miss Chocolate's choir sing at the Southern Baptist Convention in front of 10,000 people. Can you imagine? It was wonderful. Now, Miss Chocolate, she was like a mother to those kids. And she was like a father to those kids because they didn't have one. And they loved her to death. Loved her to death. You see, a life worth living has profound methods. Then one more. A life worth living shares with others. In verse 8, it says, "Thus, caring for you so much, we were pleased not only to give you the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you became dear to us." Isn't that amazing? He says, a life worth living shares with others, to give, to share with you. Two things. The gospel, because that's the greatest news in the world to anybody. They may not think so at first, but it's the greatest news in the world. To experience what Leah and Monica sang about, the amazing grace of God that comes to us and forgives all of our sins, breaks the chains of the past, and gives us a new life. We all need that. And to share it is worthy. But he also says, not only that, but to share our very lives with you, our very selves with you, our very souls. A life worth living shares with other people like that. In 1956, there were 5 missionaries that were killed on a beach in Ecuador. You may have heard at least 2 of their names. One was Nate Saint, and the other was Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot was 28 years old. The other fellows were about the same age. But they had gone as missionaries to Ecuador. And Jim had a wife named Elizabeth and a little daughter, little toddler daughter, when that happened. It started out well. They had found this unreached people group back in the jungles there of Ecuador that had never heard the gospel before. And they tried to connect with these people, first of all, by flying over in an airplane, and they dropped out gifts out of the airplane, just little different gifts. Of course, they didn't know the language, so they couldn't send any written material, but they thought sending gifts would be good. So they did. And the next time they landed their plane on the beach, and one of the natives, Auca Indians they were called, came and talked with them. And even he had the nerve to go up in the plane with them and fly around. Brought him back, landed, and they tried to let them know that they wanted to come and share a story with them. Of course, it was the gospel about Jesus. And so they arranged for a time, and they came. There must have been some miscommunication. They don't really know exactly what happened. But they found Jim and the other 4 with wooden spears driven into their bodies, washed up on the shore. Jim's wife lived a worthy life along with those missionaries. A couple of years later, she moved down there to Ecuador and lived among those Indians that had murdered her husband and brought her little daughter. And they began to slowly but surely get to know these people. And of course, these people began to realize what they had done. And most of the people in that village over time became Christians, because somebody had come to share the gospel and to live their life, give of themselves as well. Now, most of us here today, we're never going to do that. We're never going to fly off to the jungles of Ecuador. Most of us won't do that. But what about here in Niceville? What about people at the grocery store? What about people at the gas station? What about people at the post office? What about people at work? What about people at school? Are we willing to enlarge our comfort zone to not only give them the gospel, but to also give of ourselves to them?